A text without a context is a pretext. So first of all, if you don't know what the word pretext, it means not giving the whole story. Okay, so and I can't claim this little phrase myself. I owe this to Professor Berkeley Michelson, who taught at the seminary at Bethel Seminary. I attended there part-time for a year while I was also a full-time graduate student at the university. I wanted the knowledge. I had no delusions of becoming a pastor. I simply don't have the social skills. In fact, in my family, I'm regarded as being very good with babies and puppies. And she who must be obeyed says, that's Ron, that's because your social skills are at about the same level as puppies and babies. So anyway, in today's parlance, we would say a text without a context is fake news. Right? It's not the whole story. Okay, so we're going to talk about John chapter 9, and with particular emphasis on the context of that narrative. It's a worthwhile narrative on its own, but when you understand the context, I think it becomes more meaningful. So let's look at the scriptural context. Okay, so turn your Bibles with me to the book of John, and we've mentioned some of these passages before in our studies here. So let me start with John chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. And the emphasis is on this idea of light. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness to bear witness of the light, and in uppercase L on light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, John wasn't, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world. Okay, so let's go to John chapter 3, another passage, a short passage on light. John chapter 3, verses 19 to 21. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. Finally, then, John chapter 8, verse 12. Okay, passage with which you're all familiar. John chapter 8, verse 12. And then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Okay, so in this whole narrative of John chapter 9, it's against this backdrop of Jesus teaching and John teaching on light. So the whole issue of light becomes pervasive here. Now, this passage, John chapter 9, is squeezed between two feasts, okay? And it's not entirely sure which feast it was associated with. In John chapter, I think it's 7, it talks about the Feast of Booths. And in John chapter 10, there's a reference to the Feast of Dedication. I think the passage relates more to the Feast of Dedication, so let's talk about that for just a minute. So the second context to understand this passage, John chapter 9, we want to understand more about this context of the feast around which the feast was the time that Jesus gave this teaching. Okay, so there's this issue of what's called the Maccabean Revolt. So in Antiochus Epiphanes was a Greek king, and the Greeks ruled what was Palestine, Israel, at that time. So some years before Christ. So somewhere in the vicinity of 175 years, about 200 years before this actual passage in John chapter 9 took place. So Antiochus Epiphanes was a Greek king, Hellenistic king, and he ruled what was Israel. He issued this decree forbidding the Jewish religious practice, and he made a real effort to impose Greek culture on the Jews. Jews weren't very happy about that. One of the worst things he did is he vandalized the temple and he installed idols on the altar. Okay, not a very nice man. And his installation or his placing idols on the altar in the temple, some have suggested, or at least the Jews at the time thought it could have been a fulfillment of what was called elsewhere the abomination of desolation. Probably not, but at least a forerunner of that, a type of that. So anyway, Antiochus Epiphanes, okay, put idols on the altar of the temple, tried to prohibit the Jewish worship, and tried to impose Greek culture on the Jews. Well, there was an incident up in the northern part of Israel. There was a priest there, and when one of these Jews who had begun to accept the Greek culture brought a pig into the synagogue to sacrifice it on the altar, that was too much for the local priest, and he killed him. Well, the Greek king wasn't too happy about that, and this man and his 5 sons essentially went into the wilderness. And from there, they staged a revolt. And Judas Maccabee was one of the sons. So he and his father and his 4 brothers led a 3-year revolt, a 3-year guerrilla war that eventually overthrew Antiochus Epiphanes and restored local government to Israel. Okay. So this is called the Maccabean Revolt. There's an apocryphal book that comes between the New Testament and the Old Testament. We don't regard it as inspired scripture, but still there's some historical information there called First and Second Book of Maccabees, and you can find that in various places. But anyway, it gives the history of this revolt. So it was a 3-year revolt, threw out the Hellenists, okay, restored Jewish culture, restored proper worship in the temple, and it took a long time. It was a guerrilla warfare, and it was really bloody. But Judas Maccabee became known as the Hammer, okay, because he didn't have very much compassion toward these Hellenists. But anyway, it was a successful revolt. They took the idols out of the temple and out of the synagogues and off the altar, and in the process, then they rededicated the temple to God. Okay, and the commemoration of that came to be known as the Feast of Dedication. So in John chapter 9 refers to the Feast of Dedication. That's what they were talking about. Now, as part of what the Hellenists, the Greeks, had done, they destroyed a lot of things in the temple, and they forbid some of the practices. One of them related to this menorah. You know what a menorah is? Okay, a menorah is that symbol. It's an ancient symbol of Judaism, and we see it in a lot of different places. Turn to Exodus chapter 25. It talks about God giving direction regarding the menorah, starting with verse 31. You shall also make a lampstand of pure gold. The lampstand shall be of hammered work. Its shaft, its branches, its bowls, its ornamental knobs and flowers shall be of one piece, and 6 branches shall come out of its side, 3 branches of the lampstand out of one side, and 3 branches of the lampstand out of the other side. 3 bowls shall be made like almond blossoms on one branch with an ornamental knob, and a flower, and 3 bowls made like almond blossoms on the other branch with an ornamental knob and a flower, and so for the 6 branches that come out of the lampstand. Okay, well, we can go on and you get the idea there. And then turn to Exodus 27, verses 20 and 21. Now, it was very important that this menorah, that this lampstand, that the oil be placed in there and burned. 27 verses 20. And you shall command the children of Israel that they bring the pure oil of pressed olives for the light to cause the lamp to burn continually. In the tabernacle of meeting outside the veil, which is before the testimony, Aaron and his son shall tend it from evening until morning before the Lord. It shall be a statute forever to the generations on behalf of the children of Israel. So this practice of using this, what came to be known as the menorah, this menorah was in the tent of the tabernacle, okay, when they were in the wilderness. And they brought it then with them into Israel, and it was placed in the temple when the temple was constructed. Now, the issue here is that at the time they rededicated the temple after the Maccabean Revolt, turns out that they had to rekindle the menorah, okay? The problem was, so that's Judas Maccabee, okay? The problem was that there was only enough oil for one day, okay? So they used the oil that they had, and miraculously, that oil, which should have only kept the menorah burning for one day, lasted for 8 days. And the commemoration of that, of the 8 days, keeping the menorah lit, even though they didn't have the oil, until they could get more oil, came to be known as the Festival of Lights. Now, it's at the same time as the Feast of Dedication. The Jews still practice, they still commemorate, they still have the Festival of Lights every year. Who knows what it's called? Huh? Yes, exactly. It's Hanukkah. So that festival is still going. So the context of John chapter 9 is still practiced by the Jews. And it has it has to do with lighting the menorah. And the actual practice that the Jews did, they, at the time of Jesus, at the time of John chapter 9, at that time, the menorah was kept lit, but the whole temple was illuminated. And remember, the temple was on high ground inside the city gates. And when the temple was illuminated, it bathed the whole city in light. So it was against that backdrop, okay, the temple up on the mount, okay, fully illuminated, bathing the whole city in light, that Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Okay? So that's the context of John chapter 9. It has everything to do with light. Not only Jesus claiming to, asserting to be the light of the world, not only talking about John saying, he was not the light, but he was the predecessor to the light, all of that. And now we have the Festival of Lights, and Jesus heals the blind man, which of course relates to light too. All right, so let's go then to John chapter 9, and let's just work through it verse by verse. So John chapter 9, verse 1. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, you need to understand the Jewish view on suffering. The Jews attributed suffering to sin. So this blind man was suffering. He couldn't see. So the disciples automatically thought this malady, this suffering had to do with some kind of sin. Well, whose sin was it? This guy was blind from birth. Okay, he was blind from birth. How could it have been his sin? How could he sin in the womb? If not, then it must be because of his parents. So who sinned? This man in the mother's womb or his parents? And Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. And now he says it again. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So, again, we need to understand this third context. So we have one context in the preceding statements about Jesus being the light of the world. We have the context of the Festival of Light with the city being bathed in the illumination of the temple. And now we have this Jewish view of suffering, and particularly blindness. Okay? And in this case, who was responsible for that blindness? Because the Jews would have attributed that to somebody's sin. Either the poor guy sinned in his mother's womb, or the sin was of his parents. Now, the Jews believed that, in fact, that the sins of the father were perpetrated on the children. In fact, the Jews believed that that a child, until he was 13 years old, was really part of the father. And so if the father was suffering, that was why the children were suffering through sin. So, but Jesus says that wasn't the case here. The case here, this man was blind only for one purpose, so that God could be revealed. So let's go on then. So, verse 6 then. When he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay. Now, for whatever reason, the Jews believed, often treated visionary problems with saliva. Why that is, not sure what the history of it is, but that was a traditional or a conventional approach to treating visionary problems. So the fact that Jesus mixed saliva with the clay of the ground would not have been that unusual. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Now, the important point here is that when Jesus put the clay on his eyes and he sent the man to the pool, the man hadn't seen Jesus yet. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know, he couldn't see him. So he didn't know who really had done this. The pool of Siloam was constructed. It's inside the walls. It's a ways from the temple. We'll have a map here in a second. Okay, was constructed approximately 700 BC to protect the city from a siege. So if an enemy besieged the city, one of the first things if a besieging enemy, one of the first things they would try to do was cut off the water supply to the city. But the Jews had dug an underground channel from a spring outside the walls, so it would flow inside the walls to the pool of Siloam. And it actually was rediscovered in 2004 during a sewer excavation. So the pool is still there, or at least the remnants of the pool are still there. Now we need to understand where it is. So this is the temple area up here. It's the blind man that says he was sitting near one of the gates to the temple. Probably this one, because this is where Herod and this is where all the royalty was up in this area. Probably this was where the poor people lived. So he was probably sitting at that gate. So he had to make his way from here down to the pool of Siloam, probably about a half a mile or a little bit more. Now remember, he's blind and he's got the stuff on his eyes. So he has to make his way. Either he finds his own way or somebody helped him. Scripture isn't clear. It just said he went to the pool of Siloam and he washed and he came back seeing. And he said, verse 7, and so he went and washed and came back seeing. Now, when he got to the pool of Siloam and his vision had been restored, he didn't stay there. He went back to the temple. Scripture doesn't say why he went back to the temple. But anyway, he went back to near the temple. Verse 8. Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he. Others said, he is like him, looks like him. It's not the same guy, but it looks like him. And he said, the blind man said, it's me. It's me. I'm the guy who was blind and now I see. Okay. Therefore, verse 10, they said to him, how were your eyes open? Okay. He answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and I received sight. Okay, just reiterating the facts. Now, an important point here is that why would the Jews suggest that it wasn't the same guy? Why was there even a suggestion that it wasn't the same man who was blind who could now see? This relates to the third context for this passage. We'll develop it a little bit as we go along. But the important point is that a lot of people were healed of a lot of things by a lot of different healers. But no one healed the blind man. Okay? The reason is that blindness, physical blindness, the failure of light to come through your eyes is representative of the failure of spiritual light to come into your soul. And the Jews understood that only God could do that. So to say that you were healed of blindness, okay, that's something that just didn't happen. That was incredibly rare. Okay, so let's go on. So anyway, verse 11, he said, a man called Jesus made clay in my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. Then they said to him, where is he? He said, I don't know. Well, Jesus could have been standing right next to him, and he wouldn't have known because he hadn't seen him. He didn't know what Jesus looked like. Somebody must have told him that it was the man Jesus who healed him, okay? But he'd never seen Jesus, so he didn't know what he looked like, okay? And so again, it was such a rare event. I mean, no one had ever heard of a blind man being made to see. People couldn't deal with that, okay? So verse 13, they brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now here's the glitch. Now it was Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes, okay? A real no-no, because healing is a work, and you're not to do any work on the Sabbath. Of course, Jesus was not one who really put a lot of stock in that particular prohibition, okay? But nevertheless, the Pharisees said, okay, what's the story with this guy? He doesn't follow the Sabbath rules. Then the Pharisees, and now it was Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes, verse 15. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Okay? So clearly, the guy's a testimony that something very strange, something very rare has happened here. He was blind, but now he isn't. Now he sees. Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Okay, now the Pharisees have a real dilemma here. Because they have two dilemmas here. First of all, there's the whole issue of working on the Sabbath, okay? But the second issue is that they have a choice. They can say, this man is a sinner. For example, he did work on the Sabbath, on the one hand, but on the other hand, he made this guy to see, okay? Never happened before. Only God can make a blind man to see, okay? So there's this dilemma. And of course, they come down on the wrong side like they always do. And they said, verse 16, therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? Okay, if you're from, clearly the man was made to see, and sinners can't do those kinds of things. Only God can do it. So which is it? Is he a sinner? If he's a sinner, then the Pharisees have to come up with some other way to explain how this man got his sight. Okay. Others said, how can a man who's a sinner do such things? And there was division among them. Okay. So they're going to go to the blind man again. Okay. They said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? He said, he's a prophet. Okay. But the Jews did not believe concerning him, or at least, that's a reference to the Pharisees, that he'd been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. Okay, so we're on the horns of this dilemma, okay? Either the guy is a sinner, and suddenly a sinner is making a man see, or we have to acknowledge that this guy is from God. And we don't like either alternative. So let's find another way out of this. The other way out is that, in fact, maybe this really isn't the blind man. Maybe he really wasn't blind after all, or maybe it's a different person. So they call the guy's parents. And what did the parents say? And verse 19, and they asked them, saying, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? Okay. His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. Okay, so that pretty much authenticates, it doesn't give the Pharisees an out. They're still stuck with the same problem. Okay. In verse 21, but by what means he now sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age. Ask him. He will speak for himself. All right. The parents are copping out at this point. Okay. They know that the Pharisees have threatened to essentially excommunicate anyone who becomes a disciple of Jesus. Okay. So the problem here is that the parents don't want to be excommunicated. Okay. So they cop out a little bit and they say, hey, don't blame us. It's not our fault here. Ask him. Okay. He's old enough. He's an adult. Ask him how it all happened. Okay. So in fact, that's what they do. And his parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Putting out of the synagogue essentially means excommunicating. Now, there were two ways that the Jews did this, two kinds of religious punishments. One was less severe, for 7 to 30 days, depending on the severity of the offense. You could be put out of the synagogue, during which time nobody but your immediate household family could have any contact with you, and you had to go into official mourning, okay, because of whatever sin it was you had committed, okay? And that meant you had to not bathe, you had to not cut your hair, couldn't wear any shoes. Now, suppose this was intended to be a punishment on the offender with the idea of rehabilitating him. But in fact, think about it now, that's a hot culture, right? The guy isn't bathed for a month. He's only contact with the family. Who's the punishment against the guy or his family? Not sure you want to deal with the guy for a month if he hasn't had a bath. Anyway, all right, so the primary purpose of the first kind, Nidui, is essentially, hey guys, straighten up or something worse is going to come. And the worse is that, in fact, what's called harem, okay, where you're actually put outside the entire Jewish community. It was a total and final excommunication. Okay? You were excluded from any participation in Jewish community life. So in this case, it's not entirely sure what the parents were worrying about. Probably the first one, but because that was usually given as a warning. Okay. Verse 23, therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. Okay. He answered, and with this man being not the blind man, but Jesus. Okay. He answered and said to them, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know for sure is that I was blind and now I see. Okay. Okay, he puts it back on the Pharisees. He says, all right, you're the learned guys. You need to deal with this issue, okay? He made me to see, and presumably only God can do that, or he's a sinner, and if he's a sinner, you need to explain how he did that. Then they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, and now he's getting frustrated. He said, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Now that's really a sarcastic comment, right? That's a comment that you might hear from somebody like Ron McRoberts. Huh? Okay. Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. Okay. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing. You're the smart guys, and you can't answer this question, okay? That you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears. Now here's a crucial passage, verse 32. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. Okay, there it is again. It's that whole Jewish context. It's the whole idea that physical blindness is associated with spiritual blindness. And sinners can't resolve that issue. Only God can deal with issues of spiritual blindness. Okay, so, and now what's interesting here is that the man says this. He must have known something. He must have had some teaching to know that no blind man had ever been made to see. And notice what the Pharisees do. They don't debate that point with him. They accept that point. The Pharisees were in agreement that blind people were not made to see. They understood that only God can do that. Okay? Verse 33, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Okay? They answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins and you were teaching us. And they cast him out. Okay, by casting him out, that means probably this one. Okay, they threw him out of the synagogue, essentially with a warning, straighten up and fly right, or you're going to be put out altogether. Okay, so the Pharisees, rather than dealing with the issue, they decided they just wouldn't deal with it. They put the problem away, and they're not going to do anything about it because they haven't resolved the issue. If Jesus is a sinner, how can he do the work that only God can do? If he's not a sinner, then they need to acknowledge that he is who he says he is. Okay? A very difficult problem for the Pharisees, and the parents copped out, and now the Pharisees copped out too. Okay? They didn't want to deal with it. They just put it away. So verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? Okay, so Jesus went to find the guy. Remember now, the former blind man had never seen Jesus. He doesn't know what he looks like. He doesn't know what he looks like. So it's no sense for him to go to try to find Jesus, but Jesus comes to him. Do you believe in the Son of God? He, the blind man, answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I will believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. Then he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may be made blind. Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard those words and said to him, are we blind also? And Jesus said to him, if you were blind, you would have no sin, but now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. Okay. He essentially says, if you were to acknowledge that you are spiritually blind, you need spiritual sight, we could deal with your sin problem. But as long as you refuse to acknowledge that you've got a sin problem, there's nothing we can do about it, okay? That's your problem. All right, so let's go back and review just a little bit the context bit again. So the context is threefold. First of all, we have the initial passages in the Gospel of John leading up to this, many of them relating to the idea of light. Multiple assertions about Jesus being the light of the world. Okay, John records it. Okay, Jesus says it twice. He says it in Matthew. He says it in John chapter 8, and he says it in John chapter 9. Okay, again, now we have the Festival of Lights associated with the Feast of Dedication. So we have this teaching on light, and the context here is the Festival of Lights. The temple sitting on the Temple Mount is illuminated with lights, the menorah and all kinds of other lights, and it bathes the city in light. So we have then that context. The people were thinking about light. And Jesus then says, I'm the light of the world, and he heals the blind man. He says that I can give spiritual light in the form of physical light. I can give physical light, which authenticates my ability to give spiritual light. So the Jewish view of blindness, the failure of physical light to penetrate the eye indicated failure of spiritual light to penetrate the soul. And furthermore, then, only God can remedy this situation. So understanding a full understanding of John chapter 9 really is enhanced by understanding these three aspects of its context. Okay? The context of Jesus what he'd already taught on light, okay, the context of the Festival of Lights, and an understanding of how the Jews regarded the relationship between physical blindness and spiritual blindness. Okay? One was indicative of the other, and only God can deal with it. And of course, the Pharisees had to make that decision. Jesus healed them. Either he's a sinner in which case there's no explanation for it, or he's not a sinner, in which they need to acknowledge he is who he says he is. Okay. Now, have you noticed the progression, the understanding of the blind man? In verse 11, he refers to Jesus as a man. Okay? In verse 17, he refers to him as a prophet. Okay, in verse 33, he says he is from God. Okay? And in verse 38, he affirms that he's the Lord, that he's the Christ. Okay? So that seems to be a progression that all of us can understand, and that all people are on one of those categories, aren't they? Okay? Everywhere. I mean, a lot of people will acknowledge that Jesus was a good man, okay, but not very many of them will acknowledge that he is from God or Lord. Okay? So an interesting aspect of this whole passage is the progressive understanding of the blind man. So not only was he healed, but healed of his spiritual blindness, but maybe that's the healing of that spiritual blindness has led him to this level of greater understanding. Okay, so the healing itself, okay, giving physical light to the blind man, equated with giving spiritual light, it authenticates Jesus' assertion that he's the light of the world. Okay, so against this backdrop of light, everybody's thinking of light, and we're prepared as readers with light in our mind. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. And then he authenticates it by healing the blind man. Okay, so when I gave you a sneak preview at the end of our service last week, I said there was an issue of significance here. Okay? What is the significance of this passage? Okay? What is the significance of this miracle relative to other miracles? You know, there were many other miracles. Jesus made the lame man to walk. He walked on water, which I suggested is not that much of a miracle if you live in Minnesota in the wintertime. He made the blind man to see. He raised the dead. All of those things. Okay, how do we relate some of these miracles? Okay, turn with me to John chapter 11. And Pastor Mackey has talked about this a couple times, but not quite in this context. So John chapter 11, verses 30 to 36. This is the issue of Lazarus. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, she is going to the tomb to weep there. Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. That is, see how Jesus loved Lazarus. Now here's the key verse, verse 37. And some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? So understand that relative comparison. Which is more important? Okay, the Jews said, if he can make a blind man see, then surely he can deal with physical life, right? So the Jews put the greater emphasis on making the blind man to see than they did on restoring Lazarus's life. Okay? We need to understand that too, because it's all tied up in this idea of physical light versus spiritual light and physical life. Okay? So the Jews understood clearly that giving spiritual light is of greater significance than giving physical life. Okay? So we need to understand that. Now, so what is one of the consequences? When we talked about dispensationalism, whenever that was, a year ago, I can't remember. I put my car keys 10 minutes ago. How can I remember that? That we talked about the idea of how should we live then? Okay, what should be our priorities? And for me, one of the priorities then as I support missionaries is that I support missionaries who are church planting and dealing with providing spiritual life to unbelievers rather than medical missionaries who are primarily dealing with physical aspects of people's life, people's being. Okay, now that doesn't mean that we want to completely avoid that, but the important point is that as believers, we are admonished to minister to the physical and the spiritual needs of believers, but we are never directly admonished to deal with the physical needs of unbelievers, only their spiritual needs. So it's the same thing here. With unbelievers, we need to deal with their spiritual light more than their physical life. Giving them spiritual light heals them for eternity. Dealing with their physical life only heals them for a short period of time. All right. So giving spiritual sight is greater than giving physical light. Okay. Any comments or questions? Short lesson today. Any comments or questions? Oh, you guys are easy, Dusty. Right. So he came to unbelievers as well as believers. Right. Yeah. The primary purpose of this passage is the authentication of Jesus as the light of the world. And to bring that point home, the miracle is performed in the context of the Festival of Lights, and the Gospel of John prepares us for this by all these other references to light. So any other comments or questions? Sandy? Anybody else? Okay, let's just close with the word of prayer. Father, thank you for the time that you give us. Thank you for your word. Thank you for helping us to understand the significance of these messages. Thank you for making it clear to us. We thank you for your word, Father. You have blessed us abundantly, and we praise you, and we give you the glory for it in Jesus' name. All right, let's take about 10 minutes, not 45 minutes. Let's take 10 minutes for